Here we are, the end of Phil Spector week, and I'm going to be honest, I'm relieved. I didn't like talking about this guy or even thinking about him whenever I was locked up with him and I had no choice. I really hadn't planned on paroling and then spending every day telling Phil Spector stories. But they're interesting stories, and I suppose it wouldn't really be fair for me to not mention them at all. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to do one more Phil Spector video, and I'm going to wrap up some of the funny things that I can remember about him. And then I'm going to wash my hands of the subject. We won't talk about him anymore. To be honest, there's a lot more stories I could tell. I dealt with him day in and day out for years. But this was enough, right? I feel like this was enough. One area of Phil Spector's life that I'd be remiss if I didn't at least touch on is his criminal case. He was convicted and died in prison for the murder of Lana Clarkson. But it was a contentious case. There were a lot of people who thought he was innocent. There was a mistrial. He wasn't interested in speaking about his actual criminal case. I believe his lawyers had advised him against it, and it's good advice legally, so whenever it came up, he clammed up. But he was willing to speak about his attitude towards firearms, which was very important to his criminal case. Specifically, I asked him whether he had ever held a gun on Leonard Cohen whenever they were recording Death of a Ladies' Man. I asked this because I was very interested. I'm a big Leonard Cohen fan, have been for a very long time. It was neat to get the answer out of the horse's mouth, even if it wasn't really a very satisfactory answer. What he said, and I can't swear it's verbatim, but it's very, very close, was, "You have to understand, I'm a little guy. When you're little, people don't take you seriously. Nobody listens to you. Unless you pull out a gun and start waving it around. Then everybody hears what you have to say." That is a terrifying attitude to have. And there were a lot of stories in Hollywood of him doing exactly that, of pulling out a loaded gun and waving it around at people whenever he didn't feel heard. It seems perfectly reasonable to me that what happened with Lana Clarkson is that he was waving that gun around like he did with just no conception of firearm safety and shot her accidentally, killed her. Came up with the terrible lie that she had killed herself, which is just so disrespectful to her memory and her family, to try and avoid punishment for his wrongdoing. Because he was a spoiled artist. He didn't care about the safety of the people around him. He didn't care about the comfort of the people around him. Not whenever he was free and not whenever he was in prison. What he cared about was being heard, feeling important. No amount of musical genius justifies that kind of attitude, and he was sent to prison for what he did. It's a little dark. I don't want to spend this video talking about nastiness. I had some funny stuff to talk about Phil, so we're going to move on to the story of Phil Spector's ice cream addiction. He loved ice cream. A lot of people do, it's not surprising, but Phil Spector loved ice cream. Unlike the vast majority of the inmate population, he went out to visits most every weekend and could get some. But he also wanted to be able to buy it at the prison canteen. SADF was unique in that you couldn't buy ice cream at the prison canteen. They didn't have any freezers to store it and keep it cold. Phil griped about this constantly. He talked to other inmates who had been at other prisons where you could buy ice cream anytime you wanted it, and that was the thing he wanted to be able to buy at the canteen. It always bothered me they didn't sell ice cream there because, and I've mentioned it before, SADF had a lot of elderly patients, terminal patients anyway. There were a number of people who just knew that they wanted ice cream and were going to die before they could get it again because they didn't sell it in the canteen. I know it seems like a little thing, and yes, prison's a nasty place. You endure bad things. But it always bothered me. And I was always looking for a way to maybe make it so that they would sell ice cream in the canteen. I had mentioned it to the Men's Advisory Chairman-President a number of times. The president of the Men's Advisory Chairman Committee is an elected position. The inmates all vote on who they want to air their grievances to the warden, to represent them to staff. There's no real power in the position. It's like being class president of a high school, I suppose. You're acknowledged as an authority figure without any real power behind it. But he did have the capacity to submit proposals to the warden. And he and I came up with a proposal. What if Phil Spector would pay privately to have the freezer installed so we could have ice cream on E-Yard where we were housed? The warden was amenable. He looked at our proposal and he said that he could have it done, no problem. It would be about $5,000 to have a freezer installed. That seemed like a lot, but, upon reflection, they needed to use their union labor, and they needed to make sure that no contraband was being smuggled in the freezer, that type of thing. So we went to Phil. Told him, hey, Phil, we got it worked out. You want ice cream in the canteen? It's going to cost $5,000 to have the freezer installed, and if you can donate that money to the prison, it can be done. He was excited. I believe what he said was, hell yes, I want to be able to buy ice cream. A couple of grand, I don't even care. Let's do this. And so we got all the paperwork together, and at the very last minute, the warden said that he changed his mind, that it wouldn't be fair for the ice cream to just be sold on the 1 yard at the prison, E-Yard. There were 7 yards, named alphabetically, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And he wanted $35,000 to have a freezer installed on every yard. Phil was having none of it. I think he felt like he was being taken advantage of, and perhaps rightly so. It wasn't fair for the warden to change the terms right at the last minute. He said, I'm not paying that. I can't just keep shelling out money every time somebody has a problem. In retrospect, I think that it may have had more to do with the financial difficulties he was having with his wife at the time and the incredible amount of his money that she was spending than the actual $35,000 to have the freezers installed. Regardless, no freezers installed, no ice cream for Phil. No ice cream for me either, I like ice cream too. But, and I don't think it had anything to do with this proposal. I think it was determined at Sacramento, but there was a change in policy. About 2 months later, they started serving a little ice cream cup, like they might serve at a middle school, I suppose, about twice a month on the trays at dinner to the whole inmate population, with the exception of inmates who received any kind of special diet. They did not receive ice cream cups. On that list was both Phil Spector and myself. He was always griping every time that there was a meal that included ice cream that he would not receive. You knew you were going to hear about it. The reason we didn't receive the ice cream is because we were on the kosher meals program, because we were Jewish. The prison served a special meal to all Jewish inmates at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and served them separately from the inmate population. We would eat first before anybody else did to avoid cross-contamination of food. This was the result of a large lawsuit that had been filed that had nothing to do with myself or Phil except that we were Jewish inmates. The only time I actually saw Phil Spector attend Jewish services, incidentally, was to complain about the food. He'd come in, and the not quite a rabbi had come over and shook his hand and said he was glad to see another Jewish inmate coming to services, and Phil had immediately and aggressively started yelling at him about the breakfasts and the fact they weren't hot. I believe he said, I'm an old man. I need a hot breakfast. Why are the Jewish breakfasts cold? And the rabbi had explained to him very politely and at length that he wasn't in charge of that. That was a policy that had been determined at Sacramento as the result of a large lawsuit, and he couldn't change it one way or the other. Phil Spector had predictably thrown his Spector temper tantrum, the patented thing where he would stomp his foot and yell at the top of his raspy lungs until he'd get red in the face, and then he would look for something to kick or slam and storm away. You see, he didn't have vocal cords, and so he couldn't really make a lot of noise by yelling, in spite of the fact he would try. So he'd find other ways to make a bit of noise. Maybe he'd kick a wall or slam a door or, stomp his foot. I don't think that Phil Spector ever ate breakfast or lunch in the chow hall after that, which worked out for me. You see, I was the dining clerk at that time. It was my job to make the list of inmates who were allowed to work in the kitchen in a given day and to order the food that the inmate population was going to consume in the dining hall. There were some perks to that job. One of them was that every single day I got to walk out of the chow hall with a nice fat bag of food with Spector written on it, the breakfast and lunch that he elected to not pick up. It was better than being thrown away, I suppose, and I felt like I was making out like a bandit. This extra meal, the eating separate from everybody else, the special meals thing, it did not work out well for myself and a couple of other Jewish inmates in the long term. The reason that I stopped my association with Phil Spector is because I was moved to D yard, the high security level 4 yard. Myself and 4 other Jewish inmates were moved in what was a pretty nasty piece of anti-Semitism. You see, the gymnasium in which we were housed, there were no electronic locks. The officer in charge of the gymnasium could not simply press a button and open a door. He had to stand up and walk 30 feet and physically open the door with a key whenever inmates needed to get in or out. Because the Jewish inmates ate separately from everybody else, he needed to get up twice a day for breakfast and dinner and open that door for us. He complained about it a number of times. He resented having to get up that extra 2 times. I guess it felt a lot like work. And eventually he put in the paperwork to have the 5 of us, no one else, just the 5 Jewish inmates in the gymnasium, moved to D yard, again the high security level 4 yard, where there were knives and gangs. It was a scary place. To demonstrate exactly what kind of place D yard was, I'd been there about a half hour and I was washing my hands whenever another inmate, a white inmate, kind of sidled up to me and went, hey new white guy, hey, let me get at you real quick. I wasn't used to thinking in terms of race at this point because E-Yard, where I'd been housed, it wasn't a racially charged environment. I was just Aaron. One of my best friends was a black guy named Poochie. We got along great. Apparently D-Yard wasn't that kind of place because, new white guy. I was on my guard immediately. I wasn't used to being referred to as new white guy. Told him, hey, what do you need? And he pulled out a knife, fat shiv. Said, hey, I got an extra piece, man. You need to hold on to this. This is a serious fucking place. He didn't have a knife. He had 2. He had an extra to hand off to a new white guy if he saw him. That's how serious this place was, that he thought that the new white guy better be strapped from day one. And he wasn't wrong. D-Yard, D-Gym, where I was housed, was some of the worst time that I did. I hated it there. It was a nightmare. If it hadn't been for the 1 or 2 friends that I made, I don't know if I could have kept my sanity there. But it was a sacrifice that I made being moved there because of values that I held. I was moved there because I had declared myself as a Jewish inmate and stood up for myself as a Jewish inmate. And there's a lesson there. If you aren't willing to suffer for the things that you believe, you don't really believe them. You're pretending to believe them. If you've drawn a line in the sand as to who you are, what you're willing to tolerate, what's important to you, the way that you cement that line, the way that you make it real is by suffering for it. Values that are not suffered for, they're theoretical. Once you really stand for something that you believe in, it becomes real. And that's true in prison and it's true out here in the real world. If you have a value that you believe in, that is important to you, it defines who you are, you must be prepared to suffer for it. Or it's just something that you tell yourself that you're not willing to back up.